Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we start today's case, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe to support us, click the like button, and let's get into the case. Derek Kozlowski checked his dive watch for the third time in as many minutes. The crisp Galapagos morning air filled his lungs as he stood on the gently rocking deck of the Nautilus Explorer, a 32-meter live-aboard vessel that had been his home for the past 4 days. 20 years of diving experience had taught him that meticulous preparation was the difference between an incredible dive and a disaster. At 37, he was in the best shape of his life, and this trip to the Galapagos Islands was a reward to himself for landing a major client at his architectural firm in Seattle. "You're double-checking everything today," said Mara Santos, the dive instructor who'd been guiding their group through the waters surrounding the archipelago. Her Ecuadorian accent was slight but noticeable, her English nearly perfect after years of working with tourists from around the world. "Just excited," Derek replied, adjusting the strap on his mask. "I've been waiting to dive Gordon Rocks my entire life." He patted the underwater camera housing strapped to his wrist. "And I'm not leaving without getting some killer shots." Mara's expression shifted subtly. "Remember the briefing. Gordon Rocks can have strong currents. We stay together as a group." She glanced at his camera. "And remember, no flash photography. Around the wildlife, it disturbs them." Derek nodded absently as he continued his equipment check. He'd heard it all before. The Galapagos National Park regulations were strict about wildlife interactions, but he'd paid nearly $8,000 for this trip. He wasn't about to come home without the perfect underwater portfolio to show for it. The Nautilus Explorer had anchored near Gordon Rocks, a collection of eroded volcanic tuff cones, about an hour's boat ride from Santa Cruz Island. The site was famous for its hammerhead shark gatherings and diverse marine life. What most divers didn't realize, and what the tour operators rarely emphasized, was that the waters around the Galapagos were also home to orcas, particularly during this time of year. The majestic black and white predators were infrequently spotted, but their presence was a known factor to experienced guides like Mara. As Derek finished securing his buoyancy control device, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find Cal Winslow, a retired marine biologist from San Diego, who'd been regaling the group with stories of his research throughout the trip. "First time at Gordon Rocks?" Cal asked, his weathered face crinkling into a smile beneath his shock of white hair. "First time in the Galapagos altogether," Derek replied. Cal nodded toward the underwater camera. "Just remember, we're visitors here. They're home, our privilege." I know," Derek said, the repeated warnings beginning to grate on him. "I've been diving for 20 years. I'm not going to harass the wildlife." "Wasn't suggesting you would," Cal said. "Just remember that predators here aren't used to human interaction. They don't have the same habituation as creatures in more trafficked dive spots." Before Derek could respond, Mara's voice called out across the deck, "Divers, gear up, entry in 5 minutes." The excitement that had been building in Derek's chest all morning intensified. He quickly finished his buddy check with Elise, a quiet accountant from Portland who had been paired with him for the trip. She gave him a thumbs up after verifying his equipment, and he did the same for her. The water surrounding Gordon Rocks was a deep, rich blue that hinted at the volcanic origins of the Galapagos archipelago. As Derek stepped to the edge of the dive platform, he felt the familiar mix of anticipation and focus that preceded every dive. He placed his right hand over his mask and regulator, gave the traditional OK signal to Mara, and stepped forward into the Pacific. The water enveloped him in its cool embrace. At 72 degrees Fahrenheit, it was chillier than many tropical dive locations, necessitating the 5mm wetsuit that hugged his body. Derek cleared his regulator and waited near the surface for the rest of the group. One by one, the other divers entered the water. Elise, Cal, a married couple from Toronto named Ben and Sarah, and finally, Mara. Once everyone had assembled at the surface, Mara signaled for them to begin their descent. Derek deflated his BCD and felt the weight of his equipment pull him downward. The pressure increased against his eardrums, and he equalized with practiced ease, pinching his nose through his mask and blowing gently. The visibility was exceptional, easily exceeding 20 meters. As they descended to their planned depth of 18 meters, the underwater landscape of Gordon Rocks revealed itself. The volcanic structures created a stunning topography of walls, ledges, and swim-throughs. Schools of creel fish darted in unison around the rocks, while king angelfish added splashes of vibrant blue to the scenery. Derek couldn't resist immediately reaching for his camera. He'd invested in a high-end underwater rig specifically for this trip, a Sony Alpha A7RI4 in a Nauticam housing with dual strobes. The setup had cost nearly as much as the trip itself, but as an avid amateur photographer, he considered it a worthwhile investment. Mara led the group along the edge of the volcanic structure, moving against the current so that their return journey would be easier. Derek lagged slightly behind, stopping frequently to capture images of the marine life. A school of hammerhead sharks passed in the distance, their distinctive silhouettes unmistakable against the blue water. He fired off a rapid sequence of shots, cursing internally as the distance and water clarity made it difficult to get the dramatic images he had envisioned. 30 minutes into the dive, the group rounded a large rock formation that sheltered them from the current. In this relative calm, a stunning array of marine life had congregated. Garden eels swayed in the sandy bottom, while a pair of spotted eagle rays gracefully winged their way overhead. Derek's finger worked the camera shutter continuously, capturing image after image. It was then that he noticed Mara signaling emphatically to the group, pointing toward the blue water beyond the rocks. Derek turned and felt his heart nearly stop. Approximately 15 meters away, a massive orca was gliding slowly through the water. The killer whale was unmistakable, a mature female, Derek guessed, at least 6 meters long. Her black and white coloration stood out dramatically against the blue background. She moved with the effortless grace that made orcas among the most efficient predators in the ocean, her massive pectoral fins barely moving as she scrutinized the group of divers. Derek had never seen an orca underwater. The power and intelligence evident in the animal's movements were mesmerizing. He raised his camera instinctively, framing the perfect shot as the orca moved parallel to their position. In his excitement, a critical detail slipped his mind. The strobe settings on his camera were still configured for the close-up reef shots he'd been taking moments before. When Derek pressed the shutter, both powerful strobes fired at full intensity, sending a burst of artificial light through the water directly toward the orca. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The female orca, which had been moving calmly, if curiously, suddenly changed. Her demeanor. Her body stiffened, and she turned sharply toward the group. Orcas had excellent vision underwater, and the unexpected flash had clearly startled and agitated her. Mara frantically signaled for the group to stay together and remain still. Derek lowered his camera, suddenly remembering the briefing warnings about flash photography. A cold dread spread through his body that had nothing to do with the water temperature. For several tense moments, the orca remained in place, her massive body oriented directly toward the divers. Then, with a powerful stroke of her tail flukes, she moved away into deeper water and disappeared from view. Mara immediately signaled for the group to begin a slow, controlled return toward the dive boat. The divers clustered together, maintaining neutral buoyancy as they began to swim with the current back along their original route. Derek could see the tension in everyone's body language, the hunched shoulders, the rapid breathing evidenced by increased bubble streams, the constant scanning of the blue water around them. They had covered perhaps 100 meters when a dark shape reappeared in the distance. The orca had circled back and was now approaching from deeper water, moving with deliberate speed. Orcas were known to be curious creatures, sometimes investigating divers without aggressive intent. But the animal's body language, the direct approach, the speed of movement, suggested something more concerning. Mara made a rapid decision, signaling for everyone to move closer to the rocky structure of Gordon Rocks. If necessary, the irregular terrain would offer some protection and make it more difficult for the large predator to maneuver. Derek felt a growing panic as he kicked toward the rocks. His bulky camera rig created additional drag, and he found himself falling, slightly behind the group. He glanced over his shoulder and saw that the Orca was now less than 10 meters away and closing fast. What happened next occurred with such speed that Derek's brain struggled to process it. The Orca accelerated suddenly, its massive body torpedoing through the water directly toward him. He felt, rather than heard, Elise screaming through her regulator beside him. Derek instinctively raised his camera housing between himself and the approaching predator, a futile defensive gesture. The Orca veered at the last moment, its massive body brushing past Derek with enough force to spin him through the water. The pressure wave generated by the animal's passage sent him tumbling toward the rocks. He struck his left shoulder against the volcanic surface, sending a jolt of pain through his arm. Disoriented and frightened, Derek struggled to regain his composure and position. His regulator had been knocked from his mouth during the collision, and he fumbled to retrieve it, fighting against the instinct to hold his breath. Marine safety training kicked in, and he located and cleared his regulator, taking a welcome breath of compressed air. The group had scattered in the chaos. Derek could see Mara gathering the other divers about 5 meters away, frantically scanning the water for him. He kicked toward them, wincing at the pain in his shoulder. Before he could reach the group, a shadow fell over him. The Orca had circled back and was now directly overhead. From this vantage point, the creature's size was even more intimidating. Adult female orcas typically weighed between 4 and 6 tons, and this one appeared to be on the larger end of that spectrum. Derek froze, remembering from nature documentaries that rapid movements could trigger a predatory response. For what seemed an eternity, but was likely only seconds, the Orca remained motionless above him, its left eye clearly visible as it regarded him with an intelligence that was unmistakable and chilling. Orcas had the second largest brain of any animal on Earth, and the calculated assessment in that gaze made it clear that this was no mindless predator. The Orca began to circle, spiraling slowly downward around Derek. He remained as still as possible, tracking the animal's movement while trying to gradually drift toward the safety of the group. Mara had already begun moving the other divers toward a narrow channel in the rocks, a passage too small for the Orca to follow. Derek was perhaps 3 meters from the channel entrance when the Orca made its move. With a powerful thrust of its tail, it charged directly at him. This time, there was no last-second deviation. The animal's massive head struck Derek squarely in the torso, driving the air from his lungs and sending him hurtling backward. The impact dislodged his mask and regulator. Water rushed into his nose and mouth as he tumbled through the water, disoriented and in pain. Fighting against panic, Derek managed to locate and clear his regulator again, but his mask was gone. His eyes stung from the salt water as he squinted, trying to locate the Orca or the other divers. A hand grabbed his BCD, pulling him forcefully. Through blurred vision, he could make out Mara's face, her expression a mix of determination and fear. She was dragging him toward the rocky channel where the rest of the group had taken shelter. Derek kicked to assist, his movements hampered by the growing pain in his ribs where the Orca had struck him. They were less than a meter from the channel entrance when Derek felt something clamp around his right calf. The pressure was immediate and overwhelming, unlike anything he had ever experienced. Looking down, he saw the Orca had returned and taken his leg in its mouth. The animal wasn't using the full crushing force of its jaws. A bite at full pressure would have severed his leg instantly. Instead, this appeared to be an investigatory bite, the kind orcas often used when encountering unfamiliar prey. But even this restrained pressure was excruciating, the animal's teeth easily penetrating his wetsuit and into his flesh. Derek screamed into his regulator, a stream of bubbles erupting as terror and pain overwhelmed him. Mara had not released her grip on his BCD and was now in a desperate tug of war with the massive predator. The strain on Derek's body was unbearable, his leg feeling as though it would be torn from his body at any moment. In a desperate move, Mara released one hand from Derek's BCD and unsheathed the diving knife strapped to her calf. Without hesitation, she kicked downward toward the Orca's head, the knife extended before her. Whether it was the appearance of The knife or simply a decision to release what had proven to be unfamiliar prey, the orca suddenly opened its jaws. The pressure on Derek's leg vanished, replaced by a pulsing pain and a cloud of blood that began to spread through the water. Mara immediately dragged him into the narrow channel, where Cal and Ben helped pull him deeper into the crevice. The channel was a tight vertical fissure in the volcanic rock, barely wide enough for a diver to pass through sideways. It extended upward toward the surface and inward toward an air pocket that Mara knew existed within the rocks. The space was far too confined for the orca to follow, but Derek's blood in the water created a new concern. Blood was a powerful attractant, and the Galapagos waters were home to various shark species. What had begun as an encounter with one predator could quickly escalate into a more complex emergency. Mara made a series of rapid hand signals to the group. They needed to get Derek to the surface, but they also needed to do so safely, avoiding both the orca and the risk of decompression sickness from ascending too quickly. The dive boat was positioned directly above them, but reaching it would mean exiting the protection of the rocks and crossing open water. Cal, drawing on his marine biology background, monitored the water beyond their rocky shelter. The orca remained present, swimming in increasingly agitated patterns approximately 10 meters away. Its behavior suggested it was unwilling to abandon the confrontation, unusual for an orca encounter with humans. Most killer whale interactions with divers were brief and motivated by curiosity rather than aggression. The flash, Derek thought dimly through his pain. The unexpected camera strobe had clearly triggered something in this animal, perhaps associating the light with previous negative human encounters. Commercial fishing operations sometimes used bright lights, and this particular orca might have had previous conflicts with humans. His leg throbbed with each heartbeat, the salt water intensifying the pain of the bite. Through the sting of salt in his eyes, Derek could see that his wetsuit had been shredded below the knee, and blood continued to seep from multiple puncture wounds. The orca's teeth had sunk deeply into his calf muscle, though miraculously, it appeared that no major arteries had been severed. Elise, who'd mentioned during the trip briefing that she was a nurse practitioner, moved beside him in the narrow confines of the channel. She examined his leg as best she could under the circumstances, then signaled to Mara that they needed to ascend soon. The bleeding, while not immediately life-threatening, was steady enough to be concerning, especially in this environment. Mara nodded and pointed upward. The channel they were in widened as it approached the surface, eventually opening to the air about 5 meters above their current position. If they could reach that point, they would be able to surface within the protection of the rocks, avoiding an open water ascent where they would be vulnerable to another attack. The group began to ascend slowly, with Cal and Ben supporting Derek between them. The narrow passage made it difficult to maintain proper buoyancy control, and they frequently scraped against the volcanic rock. For Derek, each contact sent fresh waves of pain through his injured leg and ribs. As they neared the surface, Mara paused the ascent and signaled for everyone to hold position, while she ascended alone to scout the situation above. She disappeared upward, returning less than a minute later with an urgent series of signals. The opening was clear, but the dive boat had spotted their bubbles and was attempting to maneuver closer to the rocks, a dangerous proposition given the underwater structure and currents around Gordon Rocks. The group continued their careful ascent, breaking the surface within a semi-protected pool formed by the circular arrangement of the volcanic rock formation. The small space was open to the sky, but sheltered on all sides by rocks that rose 1 to 2 meters above the waterline. "Ayuda! Tenemos un buceador herido!" Mara shouted toward the dive boat, which was now visible about 30 meters away. "We have an injured diver." The boat's captain, an experienced Galapagos sailor named Eduardo, was already maneuvering the vessel as close to the rocks as he safely could. The mate, a young Ecuadorian named Javier, stood ready with a rescue line. "Can you get him to the eastern side?" Eduardo called back. "There's a lower section of rock there. We can come in closer." Mara looked at Derek, who was now pale and shivering despite the relatively warm water. Blood continued to spread from his leg, creating a pinkish cloud in the small pool. "We need to move," she said to the group. Cal, Ben, stay on either side of him. Elise, help me clear a path. Sarah, keep watch for the Orca. The group began to move slowly through the water toward the eastern side of the rock formation. They remained inside the protected ring of rocks, essentially swimming through a series of connected pools until they reached the location Eduardo had indicated. Derek's condition was deteriorating. The initial shock had given way to increasing pain and the early signs of blood loss. His breathing was rapid and shallow, and he winced with each movement as the salt water continuously flushed through his open wounds. Almost there, Cal reassured him, his voice steady despite the tension evident on his face. Boat's coming in now. The Nautilus Explorer. His dive tender, a rigid inflatable boat used for shorter transports, had been deployed and was now approaching the rocks. Javier skillfully guided it into position just a few meters from where the group waited. We need to get him over that section, Mara said, pointing to a flat table-like rock that extended out just above the waterline. It's our best exit point. Moving Derek onto the flat rock proved excruciating for him. Each time his injured leg made contact with the rough volcanic surface, he cried out in pain. But with Cal and Ben supporting most of his weight, they managed to position him on the flat section where Javier could reach him from the tender. Ready? Javier asked, maneuvering the tender as close as possible to the rock. On 3, Mara instructed. 1, 2, 3. With a coordinated effort, they lifted Derek from the rock into the tender. He collapsed onto the floor of the small boat, no longer able to suppress the moans of pain that escaped with each breath. Elise immediately climbed aboard to continue monitoring his condition, while Mara directed the rest of the group to board as well. As Sarah was preparing to climb from the rocks into the tender, she suddenly froze. It's back, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The others turned to see the distinctive black dorsal fin of the female orca cutting through the water less than 20 meters away. The animal was circling the rocky area, its movements deliberate and focused. Everyone in now, Mara ordered. The remaining divers scrambled into the tender as Javier prepared to start the engine. Just as Ben, the last diver, was pulling himself aboard, the Orca surged forward. It passed directly beneath the small boat, rocking it violently. Javier struggled to maintain control as the tender pitched dangerously. Go, go, Mara shouted. Javier gunned the engine, sending the tender skimming across the water toward the waiting Nautilus Explorer. Behind them, the Orca surfaced, its massive dorsal fins slicing through the water as it began to pursue. Adult orcas could swim at speeds exceeding 30 knots when hunting, far faster than the tender could manage with its full load. The distance to the main vessel was perhaps 150 meters, a journey that would take less than a minute, but also long enough for the Orca to overtake them if it chose to. Derek, despite his pain, managed to raise himself slightly to look back over the stern of the tender. The Orca was closing rapidly, its powerful tail driving it through the water with frightening efficiency. Its dorsal fin, standing nearly 2 meters tall, sliced through the surface like a black sail. "It's coming," he shouted over the roar of the engine. Javier pushed the tender to its limit, the bow rising as it planed across the water's surface. The Nautilus Explorer grew larger ahead of them, its dive platform now lowered and crew members visible on the stern, ready to assist. The Orca closed to within 5 meters of the tender, then abruptly dove beneath the surface. The water behind them went eerily smooth. "Where did it go?" Sarah cried, her knuckles white as she gripped the side of the boat. The answer came seconds later, as the Orca surfaced directly alongside the tender, so close that water from its exhalations sprayed across the shocked divers. For a breathless moment, its massive eye seemed to study them once more, an intelligence behind it that was impossible to dismiss. Then, with a powerful flex of its body, the Orca slapped its tail against the water's surface, sending a wave crashing over the tender before it dove and disappeared into the depths. The remainder of the journey to the Nautilus Explorer passed without further incident. As they approached the dive platform, Eduardo and 2 other crew members stood ready to help transfer Derek aboard. "¿Qué pasó?" Eduardo asked as they carefully lifted Derek from the tender. "Orca attack," Mara replied grimly. He needs medical attention immediately. Once aboard, Derek was carried to the ship's infirmary, a small but well-equipped space designed to handle the various injuries that could occur during diving expeditions. The ship's medic, a former paramedic named Miguel, immediately began assessing Derek's injuries. "The leg is the primary concern," Miguel said after cutting away what remained of Derek's wetsuit. "Multiple puncture wounds, significant tissue damage. So I'm also worried about these ribs. At least 2 appear to be cracked, possibly broken." Elise stepped forward. "I'm a nurse practitioner. Can I assist?" Miguel nodded gratefully. "We need to clean these wounds thoroughly, control the bleeding, and immobilize the leg. There's a risk of infection from marine bacteria." As they worked, Mara used the ship's satellite phone to contact the Ecuadorian Coast Guard. The nearest hospital was on Santa Cruz Island, about an hour away by boat. Given the severity of Derek's injuries and the need for specialized care, they would attempt to arrange a medical evacuation by helicopter to Quito on the mainland, where the hospital facilities were more advanced. "They're dispatching a helicopter from the naval base at Baltra," Mara reported after finishing the call. "ETA approximately 50 minutes. Derek lay on the examination table, an IV now running into his arm, delivering fluids and antibiotics. The pain medication Miguel had administered was beginning to take effect, dulling the sharp agony in his leg to a more manageable throb. His mind, however, remained crystal clear, replaying the attack in vivid detail. "I shouldn't have used the flash," he said, his voice hoarse. "You warned me. Everyone warned me." Mara stood beside him, her expression a complex mixture of concern and restrained frustration. "What's done is done," she said finally. "The important thing now is your recovery." "Have you ever seen anything like this before?" Derek asked. "An orca attacking a diver?" Mara shook her head. "Never. I've encountered orcas while diving perhaps a dozen times in my career. They're usually curious but cautious. I've never seen one display aggression like this." Cal, who had remained in the infirmary to assist if needed, offered his perspective. "Orcas are apex predators with complex social structures and hunting behaviors. They're also highly intelligent and capable of remembering past experiences. It's possible this particular female had a negative encounter with humans previously." "The flash," Derek repeated, wincing as Miguel cleaned a particularly deep puncture wound. "It must have triggered something." "Possibly," Cal agreed. "Or it could have been investigating an unfamiliar object in its territory. Orcas are known to use exploratory bites to identify potential prey. The fact that it didn't apply full pressure suggests it wasn't hunting you as food." This observation, while scientifically accurate, provided little comfort to Derek as he looked at the ragged tears in his calf muscle. The orca's dental pattern was clearly visible in the arrangement of the wounds, a series of deep punctures from the conical teeth, surrounded by more superficial lacerations where the flesh had torn as the animal had adjusted its grip. "Will I be able to dive again?" Derek asked, the question directed at no one in particular. Miguel paused in his treatment. "With proper medical care and rehabilitation, yes, these wounds will heal, but it will take time." Time, Derek thought bitterly. Time to heal physically, but what about mentally? Even now in the safety of the ship's infirmary, he could feel the phantom pressure of the orca's jaws around his leg, see the intelligent assessment in its eye as it circled above him. Would he ever be able to enter the water again without that? Memory surfacing? The remainder of the time waiting for the helicopter passed in a blur of medical procedures and paperwork. Miguel and Elise worked efficiently to stabilize Derek's condition, cleaning and dressing his wounds, administering additional medication for pain and to prevent infection, and preparing him for transport. Eduardo had steered the Nautilus Explorer closer to Santa Cruz Island to facilitate the medical evacuation. When the distinctive thump of helicopter rotors finally became audible, a palpable relief spread through the vessel. The Ecuadorian Navy helicopter, a Bell 412, hovered above the ship's bow, the downwash from its rotors creating a maelstrom of spray across the deck. A rescue paramedic was lowered on a harness, followed by a basket stretcher designed for such evacuations. After a brief consultation with Miguel and Elise, the paramedic supervised Derek's transfer into the basket. His leg had been immobilized, and additional IV lines established to maintain hydration and medication during the flight. "We will take good care of him," the paramedic assured Mara as they prepared to lift Derek to the hovering helicopter. Hospital. Carlos Andrade Marin in Quito has excellent trauma facilities. As Derek was being secured in the basket, Cal approached and pressed something into his hand. "Your camera's memory card," he explained. "The housing was damaged in the attack, but the card should be intact. When you're ready, perhaps the images will help you process what happened." Derek closed his fingers around the small plastic card, unsure whether he would ever want to see the photos that had preceded the attack, but he nodded gratefully to Cal nonetheless. "Safe journey," Mara said, squeezing Derek's shoulder gently. "I'll follow up with the hospital tonight." The basket was lifted smoothly into the air, Derek's stomach lurching as he swung beneath the helicopter. The sensation of weightlessness triggered a flashback to being tumbled through the water by the Orca's charge, and he closed his eyes tightly, fighting back a wave of nausea and fear. When he opened them again, the Nautilus Explorer had diminished below, becoming just another small vessel on the vast Pacific. As the helicopter banked toward the Ecuadorian mainland, Derek caught a final glimpse of Gordon rocks in the distance, the volcanic formations jutting from the blue water like the teeth of some ancient sea monster. Somewhere in those waters, the female orca continued her patrol, a supreme predator in an environment where humans were merely visitors, a fact that Derek had learned in the most visceral way possible. The flight to Quito lasted just under 2 hours, during which Derek drifted in and out of consciousness. The combination of pain medication, blood loss, and the emotional aftermath of the attack left him disoriented and exhausted. The paramedic monitored his vital signs continuously, occasionally adjusting the IV flow or offering reassuring words in accented English. Hospital Carlos Andrade Marin was the largest public hospital in Ecuador, a sprawling complex in the capital city of Quito. As the helicopter descended toward the rooftop landing pad, Derek glimpsed the city spread out across the valley, surrounded by the towering peaks of the Andes. At an elevation of nearly 3,000 meters, the air was thin and cool, a stark contrast to the humid warmth of the Galapagos. The transition from helicopter to hospital was a blur of activity and Spanish conversations too rapid for Derek to follow. He was wheeled through corridors and into an emergency treatment area where a team of doctors and nurses immediately began assessing his condition. "Mr. Kozlowski, I am Dr. Valeria Mendoza," a woman in surgical scrubs introduced herself, her English precise and professional. "I will be overseeing your care. We need to take you to surgery to properly clean and repair the wounds on your leg. Do you understand?" Derek nodded weakly. "How bad is it?" Dr. Mendoza's expression remained neutral, but her eyes held a clinical concern. "The bite has caused significant damage to your gastrocnemius and soleus muscles, what we call the calf muscle complex. There is also damage to some of the smaller blood vessels, though fortunately the major arteries and nerves appear intact. Additionally, we believe you have 3 fractured ribs from the initial impact. Will I be able to walk normally again?" "With proper treatment and rehabilitation, yes, but it will require time and dedication on your part." She placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We have excellent orthopedic and vascular specialists here. We will do everything possible to ensure a full recovery." The surgical preparation proceeded rapidly after that. Consent forms were signed, additional pain medication administered, and Derek found himself counting backward from 10 as the anesthesia took effect. He awakened hours later in a recovery room, the ceiling tiles above him swimming in and out of focus. The pain in his leg was now a distant, muffled sensation, tempered by what he assumed were powerful post-surgical analgesics. A steady beeping from nearby monitors provided a rhythmic backdrop to the hushed conversations of medical staff. "Ah, you are awake," said a voice to his right. A nurse was adjusting one of the IV bags hanging beside his bed. "How is your pain? On a scale of 1 to 10? Derek considered the question, taking stock of his body. 3, maybe 4, he replied, his voice raspy from the intubation tube that had been removed after surgery. Good. The doctor will be here soon to explain everything. She offered him a small cup of water with a straw, which he accepted gratefully. Dr. Mendoza arrived shortly thereafter, accompanied by a younger doctor she introduced as Dr. Esteban Reyes, the orthopedic surgeon who had assisted with the procedure. The surgery went well, Dr. Mendoza began, reviewing notes on a tablet. We were able to clean all the wounds thoroughly and repair the damaged muscle tissue. There was less bacterial contamination than we feared, likely due to the prompt flushing, and antibiotics provided on the boat. What's the recovery timeline? Derek asked, his architect's mind already trying to create a structural framework for the months ahead. Dr. Reyes stepped forward. You will need to remain in the hospital for at least 7 to 10 days to monitor for infection and begin the initial rehabilitation. After that, you will require specialized physical therapy for approximately 3 to 4 months. He gestured toward Derek's immobilized leg. We have inserted a drain that will remain for a few days, and the external wounds will need regular dressing changes. Derek nodded, trying to absorb the information through the fog of medication and exhaustion. And the ribs? 3 fractures. As we suspected, Dr. Mendoza confirmed. They will heal on their own with time and rest. We've wrapped them to provide support and help manage the pain, but there's little else to be done for rib fractures except to allow the body to heal itself. The following days passed in a monotonous cycle of medical procedures, pain management, and increasingly uncomfortable periods of wakefulness as the reality of his situation settled in. Derek's leg throbbed beneath its bandages, and each breath sent sharp pains through his ribcage despite the medication. On the 3rd day after surgery, a hospital administrator appeared with news that his travel insurance company had been contacted and arrangements were being made for his eventual transfer back to the United States once he was stable enough to travel. The administrator also handed him a phone, explaining that it had been delivered by courier from the dive company, along with his personal effects from the boat. The phone contained several missed calls and messages from his family and friends who had been notified of the accident. It also held an email from Mara, checking on his condition and informing him that she had filed the necessary incident reports with the Galapagos National Park Service. Attached to her email was a brief video clip taken by another diving group that had been at Gordon Rocks the day after the attack. It showed the female orca still patrolling the same area, apparently unaffected by the previous day's events. Mara had included it with a note. Nature continues its course. Your presence was a brief moment in her life, though I know her presence will remain longer in yours. Derek stared at the frozen image of the orca for a long time, before closing the email without playing the video. He wasn't ready to see the animal again, even through the safety of a screen. That evening, Dr. Mendoza arrived with another doctor, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked black hair pulled back in a neat bun. Mr. Kozlowski, this is Dr. Isabella Fuentes, one of our staff psychologists, Dr. Mendoza introduced. It is standard procedure for us to offer psychological support to patients who have experienced traumatic events. Derek's instinct was to refuse. He'd always dealt with challenges independently, maintaining the self-sufficient facade that had served him well in both his personal and professional life. But as he opened his mouth to decline, he was suddenly overwhelmed by a vivid flashback, the pressure of the orca's jaws, the cold intelligence in its eye, the certainty that he was about to die in that moment. Yes, he heard himself say instead, I think that would be helpful. Dr. Fuentes nodded, taking the seat beside his bed. Many people who survive animal attacks experience symptoms similar to post-traumatic stress disorder, she explained. Flashbacks, anxiety, sleep disturbances, and a persistent fear associated with the circumstances of the attack. These are normal responses to an abnormal event. I keep seeing it, Derek admitted, every time I close my eyes. Tell me about what you see, Doctor. Fuentes encouraged. Derek described the attack in detail, the initial shock of the orca's appearance, the moment when his camera flash had visibly agitated the animal, the terrifying power he'd felt as it struck him, and finally, the crushing pressure as it had taken his leg in its mouth. "I know it sounds strange," he concluded, "but what stays with me most is the eye. There was intelligence there. Not just instinct or hunger, it was evaluating me, making decisions." Dr. Fuentes nodded. Orcas are highly intelligent mammals, with complex social structures and problem-solving abilities. Your perception of intentionality in its actions is likely accurate. "That almost makes it worse," Derek said. "If it had just been mindless predation, maybe it would be easier to process. But it chose to attack me. It remembered me after that first pass. It waited and watched and decided to come back. And that intentionality makes the experience more frightening. More personal," Derek clarified. "Like it wasn't just a random incident, but something specific between that orca and me." Over the next several days, Dr. Fuentes continued their sessions, helping Derek begin to process the psychological impact of the attack. She introduced techniques for managing the flashbacks and anxiety that surfaced regularly, particularly at night when the hospital quieted and his mind had fewer distractions. Meanwhile, his physical recovery progressed steadily. The drain was removed from his leg on the 5th day, and physical therapy began cautiously, focused initially on maintaining mobility in his ankle and knee to prevent stiffness while the deeper tissues healed. On the 8th day after surgery, Dr. Mendoza declared him stable enough for international travel, though with strict medical precautions. His insurance company had arranged for a medical evacuation flight to Seattle, complete with a nurse to accompany him throughout the journey. "You have been an excellent patient," Dr. Mendoza told him during her final examination, "but your recovery is just beginning. You must follow the rehabilitation plan precisely when you return home." Derek promised that he would, genuinely grateful for the care he'd received. As difficult as the past week had been, he recognized that it could have been much worse. The orca could have applied its full bite force, which would have crushed his leg beyond repair. It could have attacked multiple times, rather than retreating after that single bite. He had in many ways been fortunate despite the trauma. The medical evacuation flight departed Quito the following morning, a specially equipped Learjet with a medical bay where Derek could lie flat during the journey. The flight path would take them north along the Pacific coast, with a brief refueling stop in Los Angeles before continuing to Seattle. As the aircraft climbed above the Andes, Derek gazed out the window at the receding landscape of Ecuador. Somewhere to the west, beyond the visible horizon, lay the Galapagos archipelago, those remarkable islands where evolution had shaped unique species over countless generations. In the vastness of the Pacific surrounding those islands, the female, Orca, continued her life, perhaps now with a new wariness of humans, with their strange devices that emitted sudden flashes of light. For her, the encounter had been just one moment in an existence spent patrolling the rich waters of the archipelago. For Derek, it had irreversibly altered the course of his life. The flight to Seattle took approximately 9 hours, including the stopover in Los Angeles. By the time they began their descent into SeaTac Airport, Derek was exhausted despite having spent the entire journey lying down. Each bump of turbulence had sent pain through his injured leg and ribs, and the combination of pain medication and altitude had left him with a persistent headache. A medical team was waiting on the tarmac when they landed, and the transition from aircraft to ambulance was handled with efficient care. Derek had arranged to be admitted to University of Washington Medical Center, where he would continue his recovery under the supervision of specialists in orthopedic trauma. His parents were waiting at the hospital when he arrived. His father, Richard, a retired mechanical engineer whose precise analytical approach to life had clearly influenced Derek's own personality, and his mother, Helen, a former elementary school teacher whose warmth balanced her husband's sometimes distant pragmatism. "Oh, Derek," his mother said, her voice catching as she saw him being wheeled into the room. She moved forward immediately, careful to embrace him without disturbing his injuries. His father stood slightly back, his face a mask of controlled concern. "You're looking better than I expected, considering what happened," he said, which was as close to emotional expression as Richard Kozlowski typically came. "I'm okay, Dad," Derek assured him, recognizing the worry beneath his father's stoic exterior. Really, the doctors in Ecuador did great work. The next several days involved a thorough reassessment by the American medical team, adjustment of his pain management regimen, and the development of a comprehensive rehabilitation plan. Derek was discharged from the hospital after 4 days, with arrangements for home healthcare visits and outpatient physical therapy scheduled 3 times weekly. His parents insisted that he stay with them during the initial recovery period, and Derek reluctantly agreed. His own apartment, a sleek, minimalist space in downtown Seattle, was not ideally suited for someone with limited mobility. His parents' single-story home in Bellevue, on the other hand, had guest accommodations on the main floor and fewer obstacles to navigate. The reality of his circumstances became clearer once he was settled in his childhood bedroom, now converted to a neutral guest room but still unmistakably the space where he had grown up. The architectural magazines he'd collected as a teenager had been replaced by tasteful landscape prints, but the bones of the room remained the same. The proportions, the quality of light through the east-facing windows, the way sound carried from the kitchen down the hallway. Derek's firm had been supportive, arranging for him to work remotely during his recovery. His assistant forwarded essential documents and coordinated video conferences when necessary, but the partners had insisted that he focus primarily on healing. It was a gesture of goodwill that Derek appreciated, though the forced inactivity chafed against his naturally driven personality. Physical therapy proved to be both the most challenging and most rewarding aspect of his recovery. His therapist, a former competitive swimmer named Marcus, pushed him relentlessly while maintaining an encouraging attitude that made the grueling sessions bearable. The muscle damage was extensive, Marcus explained during their first session, gently manipulating Derek's calf to assess mobility and pain response. But you're lucky, the orca's teeth created clean punctures rather than tearing the muscle fibers across their length. That means we have a better starting point for rebuilding strength. How long until I can walk normally? Derek asked, wincing as Marcus found a particularly tender spot. Without the walking boot? Probably 6 to 8 weeks. But normal is relative. You'll likely have a noticeable gait difference for several months, and it might be 6 to 8 months before you're back to activities like running or hiking with confidence. Derek nodded, accepting the timeline. And diving? When could I dive again? Marcus paused, his expression becoming more serious. Physically, you could probably return to diving in about 8 months, assuming your recovery stays on track. But... He hesitated. But what? The psychological aspect of returning to the water after an experience like yours, that's outside my expertise. Have you considered talking to someone about that part of your recovery? Derek looked away. Dr. Fuentes had provided him with a referral to a trauma specialist in Seattle, but he hadn't made the call yet. Part of him worried that speaking about his fears would somehow make them more real, more permanent. I'll get around to it, he said non-committally. As the weeks passed, Derek's physical recovery progressed steadily. The walking boot was replaced. With a compression sleeve and his reliance on pain medication decreased. He graduated from a walker to crutches and eventually to a cane that he used primarily for longer distances or when fatigue made his gait unsteady. The psychological healing, however, proved more elusive. Derek found himself avoiding news stories or documentaries about marine life, changing the channel immediately if an orca appeared on screen. He declined an invitation to join friends on a whale-watching tour, manufacturing an excuse about a work deadline rather than admitting the real reason for his refusal. Sleep remained problematic. Almost nightly, he would jerk awake from dreams where he was back in the water, the massive black and white form emerging from the blue to engulf him. Sometimes in these dreams, he wasn't at Gordon Rocks, but in the protected waters of Puget Sound, the orca somehow having followed him home to complete what it had begun in the Galapagos. 6 weeks after returning to Seattle, Derek finally contacted the trauma specialist Dr. Fuentes had recommended. Dr. Sarah Kim operated a private practice specializing in PTSD and related anxiety disorders, with particular experience working with survivors of animal attacks and natural disasters. Many people in your situation experience what we call delayed help-seeking, Dr. Kim said during their first session. There's often a desire to prove to yourself that you can handle the psychological aftermath independently, particularly when the physical recovery is progressing well. Derek nodded, recognizing himself in her description. I keep telling myself, it's getting better, and in some ways it is. The flashbacks aren't as frequent. But, Dr. Kim prompted, but I'm avoiding things I never would have before. Water, mainly. I used to love swimming, boating. Now the thought of being in open water. He shook his head, and I haven't even looked at the photos from that day. The photos from the dive? Yes, the memory card survived even though the camera housing was damaged in the attack. Everyone keeps telling me I should look at them, that it might help me process what happened, but I can't bring myself to do it. Doctor. Kim considered this. Sometimes avoidance is a protective mechanism that serves a purpose during the initial recovery period, but at some point, confronting these triggers in a controlled, supported way becomes necessary for complete healing. Over the following weeks, Dr. Kim worked with Derek using a combination of cognitive behavioral therapy and exposure techniques. They started with simple visualizations, progressing to looking at photographs of orcas in non-threatening contexts, and eventually to brief videos of the animals in their natural habitat. Each step was challenging, often triggering anxiety responses that Derek had to learn to manage using breathing techniques and cognitive restructuring. But gradually, the intensity of these responses began to diminish. 3 months after the attack, Derek returned to his apartment in downtown Seattle. His physical recovery had progressed to the point where he no longer needed daily assistance, though he continued with twice-weekly physical therapy sessions and used a cane when walking longer distances. His return to the office was celebrated by his colleagues who had organized a small gathering with cake and coffee in the firm's conference room. Derek appreciated the gesture, though he found himself withdrawing slightly from the social interaction, still uncomfortable with repeatedly recounting the details of the attack to curious co-workers. One evening in late September, nearly 4 months after the incident at Gordon Rocks, Derek sat alone in his apartment, nursing a glass of whiskey as he stared at the small SD card on his coffee table. He had carried it with him since his return from Ecuador, transferring it from pocket to pocket, bag to bag, but never inserting it into a card reader. Tonight, something felt different. Perhaps it was the progress he'd made in therapy, or simply the accumulation of time between himself and the traumatic event. Whatever the reason, Derek felt a readiness that had been absent before. He retrieved his laptop, inserted the card, and watched as the folder of images appeared on his screen. There were hundreds of photos from the Galapagos trip. Colorful reef fish, marine iguanas basking on black volcanic rocks, blue-footed boobies performing their awkward courtship dances. Then came the underwater sequence from Gordon Rocks. Derek's breath caught as he clicked through images of the vibrant marine life around the volcanic formation. And then, suddenly, there it was, the first photo of the orca. The image was perfectly composed, a testament to Derek's photographic skill, despite the surprise of the encounter. The female orca was captured in profile against the blue water, her black and white coloration striking in its contrast. Her eye was visible, seemingly calm and curious, as she observed the group of divers. Derek clicked to the next image and the next, documenting the sequence leading up to the attack. The final photo, taken just as the flash had fired, showed the orca's sudden change in posture, the stiffening of her body, the slight opening of her mouth, the altered angle of her pectoral fins as she prepared to turn toward the divers. There were no images after that. The camera had been damaged in the initial impact, the housing eventually flooding and the electronics failing. But these photos, particularly the last one, provided a visual record of the moment when everything had changed. Derek studied the final image for a long time, zooming in on the orca's eye. There was something in that gaze, not malice or hunger, but perhaps a kind of affronted territoriality. This was an apex predator responding to what it perceived as a potential threat in its domain. For the first time since the attack, Derek felt something shift in his understanding of the event. The Orca hadn't been pursuing some vindictive agenda against him personally. It had been reacting as its evolutionary programming and life experience had taught it to react. The encounter had been fundamentally asymmetrical. To Derek, a life-altering trauma. To the Orca, a brief interaction with an unfamiliar element in its environment. He saved the images to his computer and ejected the memory card, turning it over in his fingers thoughtfully. Then he reached for his phone and scrolled to a contact he hadn't used since before the attack. "Derek?" Mara's voice carried the slight delay of an international call. "How are you?" "Better," he replied honestly. "Getting there anyway. Listen, I was wondering if you could put me in touch with Cal Winslow. I'd like to talk to him about something." 2 weeks later, Derek sat in a coffee shop near the University of Washington campus, waiting for Cal to arrive. The retired marine biologist had returned to San Diego after the Galapagos trip, but was in Seattle for a conference on marine mammal conservation. Cal spotted Derek immediately upon entering, moving toward his table with the slight stoop of a man who had spent decades bent over research notes and microscopes. Despite being in his 70s, his eyes remained sharp and alert behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Good to see you up and about," Cal said as they shook hands. "How's the recovery coming along?" "Physically, I'm at about 70%, Derek replied. "Mentally, it varies day by day." Cal nodded understanding. PTSD isn't linear. Some days are better than others. After ordering coffee, Derek explained why he had wanted to meet. "I finally looked at the photos from that day," he began, opening his laptop to show Cal the sequence of images leading up to the attack. Cal studied them with professional interest, occasionally zooming in on particular details. "Remarkable clarity," he commented, "and you can clearly see the moment when her behavior changes." "That's what I wanted to talk to you about," Derek said. "In your opinion, what exactly triggered the aggression? Was it just the flash or something more?" Cal leaned back, considering the question. Orcas are complex creatures with individual personalities and learned behaviors. This particular female might have had previous negative experiences with humans, perhaps with fishing vessels using bright lights for night operations, or with photographers using flashes in her territory before. So she associated the flash with danger, possibly, or it might have simply startled her in a way that triggered a defensive response. Orcas have excellent vision adapted for underwater conditions. A sudden, intense light could be disorienting or even painful. Derek nodded, thinking back to his conversation with Dr. Kim about reframing traumatic experiences. "I've been struggling with the question of blame," he admitted. "I keep thinking that if I'd just followed the rules about not using flash photography, none of this would have happened." Cal regarded him thoughtfully. "That's probably true," he said, his honesty refreshing after months of people trying to absolve Derek of responsibility. "But it's also true that you were operating with incomplete information. The standard briefings warn against flash photography because it disturbs wildlife, but they rarely explain the potential for triggering aggression in apex predators. That doesn't make me feel much better about it." "It shouldn't," Cal said bluntly. "You made a mistake that had serious consequences. The question is what you do with that knowledge now." Derek was silent for a moment. "That's actually why I wanted to talk to you. I've been thinking about using these photos, along with my experience, to help educate other divers about responsible wildlife interactions." Cal's expression brightened. "Now, that would be turning a negative into a positive. There are several conservation organizations that run diver education programs. Your first-hand account could be powerful." Over the next hour, they discussed possibilities, articles for diving magazines, educational presentations for dive clubs, even a potential collaboration with the Galapagos National Park Service on updated guidelines for wildlife encounters. As they parted ways outside the coffee shop, Cal offered a final observation. "You know, Derek, what happened to you was extraordinarily rare. There are only a handful of documented orca attacks on humans in the wild, and most of those were even less severe than yours." "I know," Derek replied. "That's part of what makes it hard to process. I feel like I won a lottery no one wants to win." Cal smiled sympathetically. Perhaps. But now you have a unique perspective and an opportunity to create meaning from it. Not everyone gets that chance. In the months that followed, Derek's recovery continued on both physical and psychological fronts. By the 8-month mark after the attack, he was walking without assistance, though prolonged physical activity still caused his injured leg to ache and swell slightly. The scars remained vivid, a semicircle of puncture marks across his calf where the orca's teeth had penetrated, with additional scarring from the surgical procedures that had been necessary to repair the damage. He had begun working with a diving, conservation organization, developing educational materials about responsible wildlife interactions underwater. His photos from that day at Gordon Rocks, particularly the sequence showing the orca's reaction to the camera flash, became powerful teaching tools. In early April, nearly a year after the attack, Derek found himself standing on the deck of a small research vessel in Puget Sound. The University of Washington's Marine Mammal Research Center had invited him to observe their work studying the resident orca populations of the Salish Sea. The morning air was crisp, carrying the distinctive scent of salt water and seaweed. Derek zipped his jacket against the chill, scanning the horizon where the water met the sky in a seamless gradient of blues. This was his first time on open water since the attack, a step in his recovery that Dr. Kim had helped him prepare for over several weeks. "We've got activity at 2 o'clock, called one of the researchers, pointing toward a distant disturbance on the water's surface. Derek turned, his heart rate accelerating as he spotted the distinctive black dorsal fin cutting through the waves approximately 200 meters from the boat. Then another fin appeared and another, a pod of orcas moving through the sound on their daily hunt. He gripped the railing tightly, fighting the instinctive urge to step back from the sight. Dr. Kim's voice echoed in his mind. "Notice the physical sensations. Accept them without judgment. Remember that you are safe in this moment." His leg throbbed with phantom pain, the scars seeming to burn as the memories flooded back. But Derek remained at the railing, deliberately controlling his breathing as he watched the pod move parallel to their vessel. "Southern Resident Pod," explained Dr. Marissa Chen, the lead researcher who had invited him aboard. "They're fish eaters, primarily salmon, completely different ecotype from the Galapagos orcas, which are marine mammal hunters." Derek nodded, forcing himself to engage intellectually rather than emotionally with the information. "Different hunting strategies. Entirely different cultures, really," Dr. Chen replied. "Orca pods develop distinct behaviors and techniques that are passed down through generations. Some exclusively hunt fish, others specialize in seals or sea lions, and some, like your Galapagos female, are generalists who opportunistically take various prey." As they spoke, the pod changed direction, several of the orcas now angling toward their vessel. Derek tensed visibly. "They're just curious," Dr. Chen assured him. "The residents are habituated to boat traffic. We maintain a respectful distance, and they choose how close they want to approach." Derek watched as the majestic animals surfaced about 50 meters from the boat, close enough that he could see the distinctive saddle patches behind their dorsal fins. One, a large male with a dorsal fin standing nearly 2 meters tall, spy-hopped, briefly, rising vertically to lift its head above the water, seemingly to observe the humans on the vessel. In that moment, as the orca's eye briefly met his own, Derek experienced something unexpected, not the paralyzing fear he had anticipated, but a profound sense of connection mixed with respect. These were intelligent, powerful creatures moving through their natural environment with a grace and purpose that humans, as aquatic visitors, could never fully match. The moment passed as the male orca submerged, rejoining the pod as they continued their journey through the sound. Derek remained at the railing long after they had disappeared from view, processing the complex emotions the encounter had stirred. That evening, sitting on the balcony of his apartment overlooking Elliott Bay, Derek reflected on how far he had come since those terrifying moments at Gordon Rocks. The physical scars would always remain, as would certain psychological responses. He had come to recognize as permanent alterations to his relationship with the ocean. He would likely never again dive with the carefree confidence he had once possessed. The sound of water closing over his head would always trigger a momentary spike of anxiety. The sight of a dorsal fin breaking the surface would always send a jolt of adrenaline through his system. But he had also gained something valuable from the experience, a deeper understanding of his place in the natural world, and a newfound respect for the boundaries between human curiosity and wild spaces. The ocean and its inhabitants existed, not for human entertainment or conquest, but as a complex ecosystem with its own rules and balances. Derek glanced at his phone, where an email from Mara had arrived earlier that day. The subject line read, "Return to Galapagos?" The message inside proposed that he join her as a special guest speaker for a conservation-focused diving trip, sharing his experience and the lessons learned with a new generation of underwater photographers. He hadn't replied yet, uncertain whether he was ready to return to those particular waters. The thought of descending again at Gordon Rocks, where the female orca might still patrol, sent a shiver through him despite the warm evening air. But, somewhere beneath the fear, a quiet resilience had taken root. The attack had changed him, but it had not defined him. The ocean that had nearly taken his life remained, as it had always been, both beautiful and dangerous, worthy of both admiration and caution. Derek lifted his gaze to the horizon where the setting sun painted the water in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere out there in the vastness of the world's oceans, the female orca who had left her mark on his body and mind continued her ancient patterns of life, hunting, traveling, perhaps now teaching her own offspring the complex behaviors of their kind. Their paths had crossed for only a few terrifying minutes, but the encounter had permanently altered the trajectory of Derek's life. As he picked up his phone to compose a response to Mara, he recognized that his relationship with the sea would never again be simple or uncomplicated. But perhaps that complexity, that informed respect born of personal experience, was the most authentic way to engage with the wild world that existed beyond human control. The orca had disappeared into the depths after their encounter, returning to its natural rhythms unchanged by the brief interaction with a curious primate who had ventured into its domain. Derek, meanwhile, would carry the memory of those powerful jaws and that intelligent eye with him forever, a permanent reminder of both human vulnerability and the wild intelligence that moved through the world's oceans, neither malevolent nor benign, but simply and powerfully itself.